Most people don't realize that the United States, in pursuing what seemed like a straightforward trade dispute with its closest ally, has accidentally triggered one of the most dramatic geopolitical reversals in North American history. What began as an attempt to extract minor concessions from Canada has instead created a strategic nightmare that could cost the American economy over $1.6 trillion and fundamentally reshape the balance of power on the continent. The mistake wasn't just imposing tariffs or threatening trade agreements. Those are typical tools of international commerce. The fatal error was underestimating the response of a middle power that had been quietly preparing for exactly this scenario for decades. While Washington assumed Canada would capitulate under economic pressure, Ottawa instead executed what foreign policy experts are calling the most sophisticated strategic pivot in modern diplomatic history. Today, we're going to examine how America's attempt to squeeze its northern neighbor backfired so spectacularly that it may have permanently altered which country controls North America's economic future. More importantly, we'll explore how Canada's response reveals a level of strategic thinking that most observers never gave them credit for possessing. For over 70 years, the relationship between Canada and the United States operated under a comfortable assumption that guided policy in both countries. Canada needed America more than America needed Canada. This wasn't unreasonable. The United States had 10 times Canada's population, the world's largest economy, and global military dominance that guaranteed security for the entire continent. Canada built its modern economy around this reality. Roughly 75% of Canadian exports flowed south across the world's longest undefended border. Canadian energy companies piped oil and electricity to American markets. Canadian manufacturers integrated their supply chains with American factories. Even Canadian culture, movies, music, television, oriented itself toward American audiences and distribution networks. This integration created prosperity for Canada, but also profound vulnerability. Canadian economic growth depended on American demand, American infrastructure, and American goodwill. When Washington imposed steel and aluminum tariffs in 2018 under the justification of national security, most observers expected Canada to protest diplomatically, but ultimately accept the new reality. The initial Canadian response seemed to confirm these expectations. Ottawa imposed retaliatory tariffs on American bourbon, orange juice, and agricultural products, politically symbolic measures that targeted exports from swing states, but didn't fundamentally challenge American economic dominance. It looked like traditional trade dispute theater. Both sides posture publicly while working toward compromise behind closed doors. But something was different this time. The tariffs weren't just about trade policy. They revealed a fundamental shift in how Washington viewed its relationship with allies. By designating Canadian steel and aluminum as threats to American national security, the Trump administration wasn't just changing trade rules. It was treating Canada as a potential adversary, rather than the closest ally the United States had ever known. This wasn't lost on Canadian policymakers, particularly those who had watched America's increasingly erratic approach to international relationships over the previous decade. The withdrawal from the Paris Climate Agreement, the abandonment of the Iran nuclear deal, the arbitrary imposition of sanctions on allies, these actions suggested that American commitment to partnership had become conditional and unpredictable. The real turning point came in February 2025, when the current American administration implemented what they called Liberation Day tariffs, a sweeping 25% duty on virtually all Canadian goods, combined with new restrictions that required Canadian citizens staying in the United States for more than 30 days to register with authorities and be fingerprinted like visitors from hostile nations. This crossed a psychological line that most Americans never understood existed. Canadians had spent generations viewing the United States as family. Difficult sometimes, occasionally overbearing, but fundamentally trustworthy. The fingerprinting requirement sent a message that couldn't be misinterpreted. America now considered Canada a security threat requiring surveillance and control. The Canadian public response was immediate and devastating. Travel to the United States dropped by 40% in the first month. Canadian consumers began actively avoiding American products, even when they cost less than alternatives. Cross-border shopping, which had supported entire American border communities for decades, virtually disappeared overnight. But the real damage was psychological. For the first time since World War II, a significant majority of Canadians told pollsters they viewed the United States as an unreliable partner that might act against Canadian interests without warning or justification. This shift in public opinion created political space for responses that would have been unthinkable under previous governments. Enter Mark Carney, who became Prime Minister in early 2025 following Justin Trudeau's resignation. Carney brought a unique perspective to the role. He had served as governor of both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, giving him intimate knowledge of global financial systems and the leverage points that actually matter in international economics. Where previous Canadian leaders might have focused on diplomatic protest and symbolic retaliation, Carney approached the situation like a central banker analyzing systemic risk. He He recognized that Canada's fundamental problem was not the tariffs themselves. It was the dangerous level of economic dependence that made tariffs so threatening in the first place. The solution wasn't to fight the immediate trade war, but to restructure the Canadian economy to eliminate the vulnerabilities that made trade wars effective. This required thinking beyond the current dispute to build permanent advantages that would serve Canada regardless of whoever occupied the White House or what policies they pursued. The first pillar of what became known as the Carney Doctrine was internal integration. For decades, Canada had maintained interprovincial trade barriers that made it easier to ship goods from Calgary to Chicago than from Calgary to Montreal. Professional licenses didn't transfer between provinces. Regulatory standards varied arbitrarily across the country. Transportation and logistics networks were optimized for north-south trade rather than east-west commerce. The One Canadian Economy Act, passed with unprecedented bipartisan support in March 2025, eliminated these barriers virtually overnight. Professional licenses became portable across all provinces. Regulatory standards were harmonized to prevent redundant approvals. Transportation infrastructure received massive federal investment to create efficient coast-to-coast logistics networks. The economic impact was immediate and dramatic. Canadian companies that had maintained separate operations in multiple provinces consolidated and expanded. Interprovincial trade, which had been declining for years, increased by 23% in the first 6 months after the Act's passage. Most importantly, Canadian businesses became significantly less dependent on American markets because domestic alternatives became economically viable. The second pillar was infrastructure acceleration. Canada had always struggled with the lengthy environmental and regulatory reviews that delayed major projects for years or decades. The Cut the Building Canada Act created fast-track approval processes for projects deemed to be in the national interest, cutting typical review times from 5-7 years to 18-24 months. The results were spectacular. A hydroelectric transmission line from Manitoba to Ontario, stalled in regulatory review for 5 years, was approved and construction began within 2 weeks. A high-speed rail project connecting Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal, discussed for decades but never implemented, received final approval and groundbreaking within 6 months. This wasn't just about individual projects. The speed of approval sent a signal to international investors that Canada had learned to move at the pace of business rather than the pace of government bureaucracy. Foreign direct investment in Canadian infrastructure increased by 340% in 2025, as companies that had written off Canada as too slow and bureaucratic suddenly saw opportunities for rapid deployment of capital. The third pillar was trade diversification, but not in the way most observers expected. Rather than simply finding alternative markets for existing Canadian exports, Carney's team focused on attracting industries and supply chains that could reduce Canada's overall dependence on any single trading partner. The European Union became the first major partner in this strategy. While the United States was imposing tariffs and treating Canada as a security threat, the EU was eager to find reliable partners outside the increasingly volatile American economic sphere. The Canada-EU Strategic Partnership Agreement, signed in September 2025, went far beyond traditional trade deals. The agreement included technology-sharing arrangements that gave Canadian companies access to European research and development networks. Defense cooperation provisions allowed Canadian manufacturers to compete for European military contracts that had previously been reserved for EU companies. Most significantly, it established Canada as the EU's preferred partner for critical minerals and clean energy technology. The Asian strategy was even more sophisticated. Rather than trying to replace American markets directly, Canada positioned itself as a neutral ground for transactions that couldn't occur between the United States and China due to escalating trade tensions. Canadian banks began facilitating trade finance for European and Asian companies that wanted to avoid American sanctions and restrictions. This neutral ground strategy proved incredibly profitable. As American-Chinese trade relations deteriorated, companies from both countries needed intermediaries for transactions involving technology, raw materials, and financial services. Canada's reputation for political stability and regulatory predictability made it an ideal location for these sensitive arrangements. The results were visible in trade data within months. Canadian exports to the European Union increased by 34% in 2025. Exports to Asian markets grew by 28%. Most remarkably, these increases didn't come at the expense of American trade. They represented entirely new economic activity generated by Canada as strategic repositioning. But perhaps the most brilliant aspect of Carney's strategy was how he handled the immediate trade dispute with the United States. Rather than escalating the tariff war or responding with emotional nationalism, he did something that confused American policymakers and media observers. He began removing Canadian retaliatory tariffs unilaterally. This wasn't capitulation, it was strategic positioning. By dropping tariffs and addressing legitimate American concerns about digital services taxes and border security, Carney stripped Washington of its justifications for the trade war. Suddenly, the United States was the only aggressor in the room, imposing punitive measures on a partner that was demonstrably trying to resolve disputes. The optics were devastatingly effective. European leaders praised Canada as a mature approach to trade disputes, while criticizing American economic vandalism. Asian governments, watching carefully as they managed their own trade relationships with the United States, took note of how Canada maintained dignity while building alternatives to American dependence. American business leaders, initially supportive of getting tough with Canada, began experiencing real costs as supply chains disrupted and expenses increased. Agriculture, manufacturing, and energy sectors depending on Canadian inputs faced mounting losses that couldn't be easily replaced. The American automotive industry provided the most dramatic example. Modern car manufacturing involves components crossing the US-Canada border multiple times during production. When tariffs were applied to each border crossing, the cost of American-made vehicles increased by an average of $300-400 per car. American automakers found themselves unable to compete with manufacturers that weren't subject to these artificial cost increases. Similar dynamics played out across multiple industries. American farmers lost access to Canadian fertilizer. Energy companies faced disrupted supply chains. Technology companies discovered that seemingly minor trade barriers created cascading disruptions in international supply networks. Meanwhile, Canadian companies thrived under their new economic strategy. Freed from interprovincial trade barriers and connected to expanding international markets, Canadian businesses experienced growth rates not seen since the resource boom of the early 2000s. The contrast was stark and politically dangerous for American policymakers. While Canadian economic indicators showed consistent improvement, American regions that depended on Canadian trade faced mounting economic pressure. Border communities in particular experienced severe economic disruption as cross-border commerce, which had supported local economies for generations, virtually disappeared. The political pressure in the United States reached a breaking point in late 2025, when representatives from border states began breaking with the administration's trade policy. Senator Susan Collins warned that continued disruption could permanently damage northern New England's economic foundation. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer described the automotive impact as economic sabotage disguised as trade policy. This created an impossible political situation for American policymakers. Backing down would represent humiliating admission that the strategy had backfired, but continuing generated mounting economic and political costs, threatening electoral prospects in swing states. Canada faced no such dilemma. The Carney strategy had reduced Canadian dependence on American markets while building alternative relationships, proving more profitable and reliable than traditional North-South economic orientation. Canada could afford to wait while America struggled with the consequences of its own policies. The strategic brilliance of this position became clear during the mandatory USMCA review in July 2026. Under the terms of the trade agreement, all three North American countries had to declare whether they wanted to renew the deal for another 16-year term. If any country refused, the agreement would enter a review process that could lead to its termination. American negotiators entered these talks expecting to extract concessions from a weakened Canada that desperately needed access to U.S. markets. Instead, they encountered a confident Canadian delegation that had spent 18 months building alternatives to American trade relationships. The Canadian position was elegantly simple. They wanted free trade and cooperation, but only on terms that respected Canadian sovereignty and provided genuine reciprocity. They were willing to discuss American concerns about trade imbalances and regulatory differences, but they would not accept agreements that treated Canada as a subordinate partner, subject to American oversight. Most importantly, Canada demonstrated that they had viable alternatives if the Americans chose to withdraw from USMCA. The EU partnership, Asian trade relationships, and internal Canadian integration meant that losing preferential access to U.S. markets would be painful, but not catastrophic. Canada could survive and prosper without USMCA. The question was whether the United States could say the same. The American business community certainly couldn't. Over 3 days of congressional hearings in December 2025, more than 150 American industry leaders testified about the catastrophic impact that USMCA termination would have on their operations. Agricultural representatives warned that losing access to Canadian markets would bankrupt thousands of American farms. Manufacturing executives described supply chains so integrated with Canadian operations that separation would require years of reconstruction at enormous cost. The automotive industry's testimony was particularly devastating. Energy sector testimony painted an equally grim picture. The United States imports more oil from Canada than from all OPEC countries combined. Canadian electricity powers the American Northeast and Pacific Northwest. Disrupting these relationships would create energy shortages affecting every American consumer. Perhaps most significantly, Technology representatives explained how integrated American and Canadian operations had become. Major U.S. tech companies rely on Canadian talent, research facilities, and data centers to remain globally competitive. Immigration restrictions and trade barriers limiting this cooperation would handicap American companies against European and Asian rivals. The cumulative message was unmistakable. The American economy had become so integrated with Canada that attempting to decouple would be economically suicidal. The United States needed Canadian cooperation far more than Canada needed American markets, given Canada's success in building alternative relationships. This represented a complete reversal of the power dynamic governing North American relations for over a century. Instead of a dominant United States setting terms for dependent Canada, the relationship had become one where Canada held stronger cards. The strategic implications extend far beyond trade policy. Canada's successful pivot away from American dependence while building stronger relationships with Europe and Asia positions the country as an attractive partner for other nations, seeking to diversify their own economic relationships. Countries that have experienced American economic coercion through sanctions, tariffs, or trade disputes are studying the Canadian model as a template for building strategic autonomy. The combination of internal integration, infrastructure acceleration, and diplomatic diversification offers a roadmap that other middle powers could adapt to their own circumstances. This is creating what international relations scholars call a coalition of the middle. Countries too small to challenge American hegemony directly, but collectively representing alternatives to American-dominated systems. Canada's leadership in this coalition gives it influence extending far beyond its economic or military capabilities. The long-term implications for the United States are profound. The country that dominated international economics through market size, military power, and alliances finds itself increasingly isolated as partners build alternatives to American-controlled systems. American companies that built global supply chains around preferential access to allied markets discover these relationships are no longer guaranteed. Countries that once welcomed American investment are becoming more selective, preferring partners offering genuine reciprocity. The American model of economic development, emphasizing market access and military protection in exchange for political alignment, is being challenged by alternatives offering greater sovereignty. The Canadian approach of building multiple partnerships while maintaining strategic autonomy proves more attractive than traditional alliance relationships. The timing of this shift could hardly be worse for American interests. As the United States faces mounting challenges from China and other rising powers, it needs allies more than ever. But aggressive unilateralism is driving potential partners toward alternatives like the Canadian model. China has taken careful note of Canada's success in building strategic autonomy while maintaining beneficial relationships with all major powers. Chinese policymakers see the Canadian approach as validation of multipolarity, a world where no single power dominates. This doesn't mean Canada is aligning with China against the United States, but rather that Canada has demonstrated the possibility of prosperity without choosing sides in great power competition. This middle path, which seemed impossible during the Cold War, is becoming increasingly viable as global power becomes more distributed. The domestic implications within Canada are equally significant. The success of the Carney strategy has created unprecedented national confidence around Canada as an independent middle power rather than a junior partner in an American system. Polling shows remarkable consensus across political divides. Conservative voters who historically favored closer U.S. ties now support strategic autonomy. Progressive voters celebrate the country's independent course. This consensus provides stability for long-term strategic thinking rather than short-term electoral calculations. The economic benefits continue to compound as Canada's approach generates momentum. International companies that initially established Canadian operations as hedges against trade uncertainty discover genuine competitive advantages encouraging expanded investment. What began as a defensive response to American economic aggression has evolved into a comprehensive strategy for Canadian prosperity that does not depend on American approval. This represents one of the most successful examples of strategic adaptation by a middle power in modern international relations. The lessons for other countries are profound. The Canadian experience demonstrates that strategic patience, internal integration, and diplomatic diversification can create alternatives to dependence on dominant powers. The key is not challenging hegemonic powers directly, but building sufficient autonomy that coercive pressure becomes ineffective. For the United States, the Canadian pivot represents a warning about the costs of treating allies as subordinates rather than partners. The assumption that smaller countries have no choice but to accept American terms has proven wrong in a multipolar world, where alternatives exist for countries patient enough to build them. The transformation of Canada from America's most reliable ally to its most independent neighbor illustrates how quickly relationships can change when based on coercion rather than mutual benefit. The fatal mistake wasn't just the tariffs, it was assuming Canada would always need America more than America needed Canada. That assumption is no longer true, and the consequences will reshape North American geopolitics for generations. What changes have you observed in Canada-US relations or economic partnerships in your area? Share your perspective in the comments below. Local observations help illustrate the scope of this continental transformation.